Thank you, Paige, and thank you for coming today. So here are two paintings of Napoleon at the St. Bernard Pass crossing the Alps. The one on the left is by Jacques-Louis David, and it's really a heroic example of propaganda. And it shows him as he wanted to be shown, calm on a fiery steed. And you can see that his cape is blowing in the wind. He's pointing the way ahead. His army is following. They look kind of like little ants to the side. And what's rather extraordinary is on the rocks inscribed, along with his name, Bonaparte, you see the names of two legendary figures. One of them is Hannibal, who crossed the Alps at the St. Bernard Pass to fight the Romans back in, what was it, the 3rd century. And the other one is Carolus Magnus, or Charlemagne, the medieval ruler who also crossed with an army into Italy. So David has created a kind of artificial genealogy, and I say artificial because there's some real myth-making here. For one thing, Napoleon did not cross on a horse, he crossed on a mule. And that's what you see on the right. This is a painting by the French artist Paul Delaroche, Napoleon crossing the Alps, which was painted almost a half century after the one on the left. And it shows Napoleon, well, on the one on the left, we have no doubt that he's headed for victory in Italy over the Austrians, whereas the one on the right, we're not so sure. He seems cold. You know, that characteristic gesture of putting his hand in his jacket, it looks like he's doing it for warmth. And what we're seeing here is a development of heroic myth-making being replaced by cold fact and description. And that's a development that we're going to be seeing playing out by the end of this lecture series. Now, they take their name from Napoleon, but they actually are going to begin before his seizure of power in 1799. It's going to begin, that is, with the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And they're going to conclude after his death in 1821. Now, much of the art that we're going to be looking at in the next 4 weeks they're really examples of romanticism. So this is an international movement which we generally associate with feeling. It tended to favor the imagination over fact, and in some cases could be infused with intense patriotism as well. So I want to show you an example of British Romanticism. This is by Joseph Millard William Turner, and you can see it really has a connection to what I was just talking about, the myth of, the idea of Hannibal crossing the Alps. That's what this is called, Snowstorm. Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps. And notice that Snowstorm is at the beginning, and this is typical not only of Turner, but generally of British Romanticism, which tends to have to do with landscape more than figures, as was the case with, say, the David Napoleon that I just showed you. And it's a really turbulent landscape. It's an apocalyptic snowstorm, and that's paralleling, you could say, in drama, the rampaging troops of Hannibal crossing the Alps. Now, there also could be a reference to Napoleon here, because at the time, England was at war with Napoleon, and there had been fear of an invasion, that Napoleon dreamed of invading England. And of course, it didn't happen. The English ended up as the victors. But back in 1812, it may not have been so evident. And the other thing is that in addition to having visited the Alps, Turner had gone to Paris, and he had actually seen a version of that Napoleon by David that I showed you. There's a number of versions of it. And he had seen Hannibal inscribed in the rocks there. I mean, it's quite possible that he had that in mind. So, as I said, we're really going to be starting with the second half of the 18th century and going into the first half of the 19th and talking about Romantic art. But I want to start first with the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is a movement we especially associate it with France and England. It's been said that America didn't have an Enlightenment because it didn't need one, because it was really conceived in the spirit of the Enlightenment. Figures like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin were Enlightenment heroes. It's this optimistic movement that really has to do with bettering society. There was a fascination with science and technology, as you can see in this painting by Joseph Wright of Derby, an English painter of the second half of the 18th century. And there also was a passion for nature seen as quintessentially good. There was an interest in bettering society, interest in things like constitutions, and the example of the as I said, the example of, say, the American Revolution was really very inspiring for some in the Enlightenment. But anyway, what I wanted to do is just start talking about this painting, which has a rather mysterious lighting effect. It might remind you of a painting by Caravaggio, that 17th century Baroque artist who had those spectacular lighting effects, very strong light and very dark combined. But here, rather than having to do with religious mystery or revelation or miracles, it has to do with the wonder of science. And so what you have here is a demonstration with a kind of solar system planetarium in which a candle represents the sun and then the planets travel around. It's called a philosopher because this man who is leading the demonstration here, he's probably what would have been called a natural philosopher. That's what scientists were called. They didn't come up with the word scientist until around the 1830s. And you can see that there's also children involved, and the education of children was of concern in, one of the things that was of concern in the Enlightenment. And I want to show you another painting that really sort of exudes the spirit of the Enlightenment. And it's by David again, but it's an earlier painting than the Napoleon, going back to really a different era in many ways, this era of the Enlightenment. And it's a double portrait of Antoine and Marie-Anne Lavoisier. So Lavoisier was a famous chemist, and he was his collaborator was his wife, who drew the experiments and actually for publications. And you can see behind her there's a portfolio of drawings. It looks as if he's looking towards her for inspiration as he's writing. And the thing that's so amazing about this is that there is a kind of geometric order and clarity to this whole painting. So notice how that portfolio, which is diagonal, just happens to parallel the crease in the tablecloth and Lavoisier's leg. And they act like sort of horizontal counterpoints to that, sort of X and Y axis that you can see elsewhere in the painting, all of these verticals and horizontals. So there's a sense here that this geometric order of the painting is a kind of visual equivalent to the intellectual clarity and order of what you're seeing. I mean, in the Enlightenment, the 17th century thinker and scientist, Sir Isaac Newton was a great hero, and so there's this sort of embrace of order and understanding of the natural world and the universe that we have here in the Enlightenment that we also see in this portrait. The other thing that's so fascinating about this portrait is, on the one hand, you have that geometric order, and it's about science in a way, but it also has that spark of warmth, as Lavoisier looks towards his wife, and as she looks towards us, as if we've entered the room. And that sense of a kind of accord with someone who's looking on, a sort of sociability, and that also comes out in this portrait, the self-portrait by Elizabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun from 1790, where it looks as if she's in conversation with you as she's painting your portrait. There's that sense of, there's a term, a French term, esprit, which is, it sounds like spirit, and it can be translated that way, but it also can be translated as mind or wit. And she seems to exude that aspect that was really very much prized during the Enlightenment. And one of the things that's so interesting is this optimism, which you sense in a portrait like this is despite the fact that she was actually in exile at that point. She had left France when the revolution broke out and lived in exile in other parts of Europe, was really very, very successful painting the aristocracy. She was a great admirer of Marie Antoinette, who actually, of course, was hated during the French Revolution and eventually executed. But Vigée Lebrun was one of her biggest fans. And Marie Antoinette had really been an influence on getting Vigée Lebrun into the academy, into the Royal Academy, which was largely closed to women. Another painting by Vigée Lebrun shows you another aspect sort of an area of enthusiasm during the Enlightenment, and that has to do with maternal love, family ties, and bonds. And this really comes out in this portrait of the self-portrait with her daughter. And it's really interesting that her daughter was known as Julie, because Julie was the heroine of a very popular novel at the time by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he's one of these thinkers of the Enlightenment who was especially big on nature, thinking that civilization corrupts and that if nature is inherently good. And he wrote a book in the early 1760s called Émile, or On Education, where he really extols the sort of natural religion of the heart and in its role in the raising of children. Now, of course, there is a bit of hypocrisy here, because apparently he abandoned his own children to an orphanage. But that was not the way his work was thought of. He really was this exemplar of maternal and family ties. Now, one of the things that's striking about this portrait is the way that Vigée Lebrun is dressed. So she looks as if she is from ancient Greece or Rome, like from classical antiquity. And a fascination and attraction to classical antiquity is one of the hallmarks of the Enlightenment. And it was for, on the one hand, examples of beauty, but also for examples of virtue, things from the past, and also for collecting and taste. So this is a painting by a British artist named Johann Zaffany called Charles Townley in his sculpture gallery. And it shows this man here seated in a chair with a dog at his feet, with his friends, poring over volumes that pertain to these copies of ancient sculptures that he has surrounded himself by, sort of learned commentary and comparison. And the idea of acquiring works like this, like copies of ancient sculptures, is something that aristocratic Britons did on what was called the Grand Tour. So the Grand Tour really goes back to, say, the 17th century with Germans, but it's especially associated in the 18th century with people from Britain. And it was a kind of a cultural bar mitzvah, sort of a coming of age, where you would go over there with a cicerone, that's a learned guide, and you would visit Rome, Venice, probably Florence, and you would also go down to Naples and the nearby former Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, which earlier in the 18th century had been discovered and excavated. And what I also list here is a work from 1755 by a German named Johann Joachim Winckelmann, called Thoughts on the Imitation of Greek Works from 1755. And Winckelmann is a rather remarkable figure in this period. He absolutely adored Greek art. Now, much of Greek art that we know is we know through Roman copies. I mean, a lot of the originals are lost. But one of the things that he especially adored was this work, known as the Apollo Belvedere. It's this large Roman copy of a 4th century BCE Greek sculpture that was attributed to a sculptor named Leochares. And the thing about Winckelmann is that it's not that what he said was so original. I mean, he talked about this kind of general beauty where you get the most beautiful parts of the most beautiful examples of men, for example, and putting them together to make something general. But it was really the enthusiasm with which he spoke, the poetic sort of surge that really was so infectious. And so I just want to give you a sense of that. I want to read from a later work by him called The History of Ancient Art, and from 1764. And so you can really think of him as one of the first art historians. He actually classified art. He came from Germany, but then went to Rome. He worked for a collector of ancient art, whose name is Cardinal Albani, and he wrote these books where he compared, different works from different periods. And, so this is what he said about the Apollo Belvedere. An eternal spring, as in the happy fields of Elysium, clothes with charms of youth the graceful manliness of ripened years, and plays with softness and tenderness about the proud shape of his limbs. The soft hair plays about the divine head as if agitated by a gentle breeze, like the slender waving tendrils of the noble vine. It seems to be anointed with the oil of the gods and tied by the graces with pleasing display on the crown of his head. In the presence of this miracle of art, I forget all else, and I myself take a lofty position for the purpose of looking upon it in a worthy manner. My breast seems to enlarge and swell with reverence, like the breasts of those who were filled with the spirit of prophecy, and I feel myself transported to Delos and into the Lycian groves, places which Apollo honored by his presence, for my image seems to receive life and motion like the beautiful creation of Pygmalion. I mean, that is really something. That's generally not how people write art history anymore, but this really was infectious. And his translator, who we're going to see later, he was a Swiss artist who settled in England named Henry Fuseli, when he heard that Winkelmann died, and Winkelmann was actually murdered, I think it was by a highwayman, he said it was as if a thunderclap went through the world. So what you have here is someone who is literally in love with these sculptures. I mean, everyone, it's well known that Winkelmann was gay, and there is this sort of passion, but there's also a negative aspect as well. This is what he didn't like. This is what he did not want. He talked about ancient Greek art as having this noble simplicity and sedate grandeur. That's what he really admired. And what I'm showing you here, I don't know which Fuchtmeyer this is. There was a whole family of them, but they are sculptors who worked in sort of late Baroque or Rococo German churches, and it's all sort of dimply, and it's a little cherub, very, very different from what you have in that sculpture on the left. Now, as I mentioned, classical antiquity could also, in the Enlightenment, be a source of virtuous stories, or stories, having to do with virtue. And here's an example. So Angelica Kauffmann was a very highly regarded artist in her day. She was originally from Switzerland, but she settled in England, and she became one of the founding members of the Royal Academy in England that was founded in 1768. And what she gives us here, is a painting of Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, from 1785. So the Gracchi were these famous Roman siblings, and this is a story about preferring your children over riches. So what's going on here is she's having, she's getting together with one of her friends, you see in red on the right, and her friend suggests, well, let's show each other our jewels. And so her friend gets out her jewels, a little bit materialistic, and Cornelia points to her children and says, these are my jewels. So you're supposed to weep. And it's a painting that really has another aspect of the Enlightenment, which is sensibility, the French sensibilité, which is like our word sensibility, but it also, in French, has overt connotations of sensitivity, especially sensitivity to virtuous actions, things that are going to make you weep and be very, very impressed. It's also arranged, in a kind of frieze of figures, rather like a Roman relief sculpture. So it's really trying to look like that. It's an example of what we call neoclassicism. That's the general term that's given to art that from this period, especially from the late 18th, early 19th century, that refers to classical antiquity and sometimes tries to imitate its actual style, try to make it look like something from antiquity. And I mentioned the Royal Academy, that she was a founding member of. And I wanted to show you this print, which shows one of its exhibitions. It's by someone named Charles Brandoin. This exhibition, this print here from 1771. And one of the things to notice is the way that the paintings are stacked up one on top of the other. And that was really the way art was shown then in, at the Royal Academy. And you'll see that a number of my slides say RA, that is the year that, indicating that something was shown that year in the Royal Academy. And also at the Paris Salon, which we're going to see later, where they would just stack things up. Now, here at the Museum of Fine Arts, in the Arts of the Americas wing, there is one room, the Vinnick collection, where you have paintings stacked up to give you an idea of what it would have looked like, say, at an American academic exhibition, where that same tradition was followed. And of course, there were problems with that. If your painting was put up at the top, it's what the English called being skied. The French called that being put up into paradise, paradis. Nobody would see your painting very well. So if you didn't have a friend or a cousin on the hanging committee, you might be in trouble. But I wanted to show you a painting that created a sensation at the Royal Academy exhibition of 1771. Perhaps you've seen it before. It's very, very famous. It was very well known in its time. There was a print that was made of it that was spectacularly, widely distributed. And it's something that was really known internationally. So it was by Benjamin West, called The Death of General Wolfe. And Benjamin West was originally from Pennsylvania. It's really a remarkable story. He crossed the Atlantic. He went to Italy. He studied the old masters, and he settled in England, where he actually became I think it was the second president of the Royal Academy. Really extraordinary kind of thing for someone from, originally from the colonies. So The Death of General Wolfe is what we would call a modern history painting. So a history painting is a painting from something like, ancient history, the Bible. I guess you could also include allegories in there. But it was considered the highest, most prestigious type of art, painting, say, in the 18th century. Certainly it was in France, but also it had this high prestige in England as well. And it's a modern history painting because it's a relatively current event that he's showing, and that really was a very innovative thing to do. So what's going on here is that this is the sort of climax of a successful battle, a victory for the British in what was called the 7 Years' War. In the United States, we call it the French and Indian War, and it doesn't really generally get a lot of attention here, but it was a very important war in which England fought France, and it really was disastrous for the French because they were marginalized in Canada and also defeated in India as well. And it cost the French an enormous amount of money, and that's one of the things that we're going to be seeing shortly leading up to the French Revolution, the financial crisis. Of course, they also had spent an enormous amount of money helping us in the American Revolution, and they were really rather broke by the time of the revolution. But anyway, what happens here is that the general dies at just the sort of moment of victory, and so he is surrounded by his these officers. There also is prominently in the foreground an indigenous man, a North American indigenous man, which would have been considered very exotic and exciting for people at the Royal Academy, but he really fits the stereotype of what was called the noble savage. And this is something that really relates to the work of Rousseau, this idea that civilization corrupts and that if you can go to some sort of state of nature, that is really preferable and a source of virtue. But you can see that he really is very specifically, ornamented with tattoos. He has very particular sort of clothing, and this is the kind of thing that's really there to make it seem like it's real. In other words, that it's actual, like an actual current event. Also, notice how the uniforms are so specific. But at the same time, I called it a history painting because history paintings are full of all kinds of drama and fakery and stage mechanisms and machinery. And so what you have here is that the general his death is sort of in parentheses of these figures, some of whom weren't there. Some of these were portraits of people who were not there. And notice how the clouds, these storm clouds, just happen to be passing so that they're parallel to that flag that's being held up. So it's a very dramatic composition. And it's as if there's a spotlight on Wolfe, and he looks rather like a dying Christ or a saint. So it's really elevating this painting to something beyond that current event. So what you have here is a sort of a formula that was used really basically for propaganda painting throughout the late 18th and deep into the 19th century. This was going to be used. And an example, I showed you already, that Napoleon at St. Bernard by David. I mean, that is, you could say, a relatively, it was a recent event, but clothed in all of this grandeur and, myth-making that really elevates it. So this is just a detail of the indigenous man. So there also was another artist from the colonies whose name was John Singleton Copley, as in Copley Square. He was really the finest portraitist in the colonies. He, like Benjamin West, he went to Italy, he settled in England, and had a really spectacular career there, showing in the Royal Academy exhibitions. So this one, and I'm sure you all know it because it's a favorite of this museum, Watson and the Shark, that was shown at the Royal Academy in 1778. And like The Death of Wolfe, it's another one of these sort of modern history paintings, this time not something from the history of national wars, but rather from the history of the patron, the man who paid for this painting. And it's a little strange to think that he wanted this commemorated, but he was a wealthy London merchant named Brooke Watson, and he wanted to have commemorated a traumatic event that took place when he was a teenager. Swimming in Havana Harbor, this ferocious shark swam up and bit off his foot and part of his leg, but he was rescued. And so this is really the heroic rescue of Watson, who is being attacked by a shark. Now, it's all arranged in a way, just like, we saw that indigenous man, this attempt by West to make it look actual. It's all set up to look authentic. I mean, he had never been to Havana, where this occurs. That is, the artist had never been there. But he must have had access to things like engravings of what the waterfront looked like. And there's a Moro castle, I think on the right, which was part of the landscape scenery there. And what he does is that he has these sort of old master references to elevate this above just this horrifying event, and to make it seem much more grand, more like a history painting, that is. I mean, for one thing, you can see how the whole composition has this rather powerful sort of pyramid and you could see that at the top, near the top of the pyramid, there is a black man, and that is also there for authenticity, because after all, this is taking place in the Caribbean. And just an example of this kind of old master elevating mechanism, the kind of thing that makes it larger than life. What I'm showing you on the right is a work which is actually in England. It was, I think, in Hampton Court at the time, but now in the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's what we call a tapestry cartoon. That is the design for a tapestry that was painted by Raphael. And you can see it's from the Life of Christ. It's the miraculous draught of fishes. And those figures that are reaching over the edge of the boat, you can see have a similarity to some of those figures in the Raphael tapestry, and of course, cartoon. And of course, that figure with the boat hook, he looks like he's about to stab the shark, really is based on this famous painting in the Louvre by Raphael of Saint Michael vanquishing Satan. So, in other words, it's set up like an authentic relatively a current event. I mean, it was back earlier in Brooke Watson's life, but it's elevated through these references to the old masters. And then there's the shark, which really appeals to a kind of interest in the horrific, which was exciting at the time. I mean, there's a term, the sublime, that was applied sometimes to things that were so impressive that they were terrifying. And they could have to do with landscape, things like, well, when I was just showing you that Turner with the snowstorm in the Alps, that really was a sublime spectacle. But this kind of thing also could apply to something that's terrifying, like a shark. I mean, it's really no accident that earlier, not much before this, back I think it was in the 1760s, you get in Britain the first, what was called a Gothic novel, the first horror novel. It was called The Castle of Otranto. It's really pretty silly, but it has to do with things like dungeons and family curses and things like that, and it was considered very exciting. Now, the whole idea of having something that is, on the one hand, current, like a current event like the death of Wolfe or like the Watson and the Shark, but which somehow parallels something from the past. That, in a way, is also something that we find in the Enlightenment. And I wanted to just turn to another example of this kind of interest in the horrific. And it's a painting by the English artist George Stubbs, a lion attacking a horse, from 1769, and it really is a terrifying image. And it's interesting to think about this in relation to the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment is supposed to be all about reason, and Stubbs actually did dissections of horses, so there's a kind of scientific interest there. But there also is there also is an element of horror and empathy also with this suffering horse, which really suggests new kind of sensibility, a new sort of area for feeling in this period that really makes me want to call this proto-romantic. It's not really completely a full-blown romantic work, but it's certainly very different from, say, the Baroque, which was earlier. And to make that point, I'm comparing the Stubbs with a Rubens, a bear hunt, where, whereas in the Stubbs, there's this sense of, empathy with the animal, a sense of suffering, the actual life of animals. With the Rubens, it's all just theatrics. It's kind of noisy theatrics in some ways for fun. There's no sense really of empathy there particularly. And that really brings us into thinking about the Stubbs does bring us into something that we really could call romantic. This painting on the left by Pierre-Paul Prudhon of a man named George Anthony from 1796. And generally speaking, Romanticism begins a bit later in France than it does, say, in Britain or in the north of Europe. But by, say, the 1790s, it's really beginning to show up. And in the case of George Anthony that you see on the left, there is a sense of sort of rapport between the man and the horse. There's a sort of a softness about that horse's face. There's also a kind of brooding moodiness about the whole thing that has something to do with that cloudy sky. And it's very different, just as I compared that Baroque bear hunt to the Stubbs. Here I'm bringing in a Baroque royal portrait by Anthony van Dyck, this Charles I at the Hunt on the right. So, they're very different. I mean, we're dealing with a king here on the right, but it's also a Baroque king. The relationship to the horse is totally different, where there is this sense of some kind of emotional rapport on the left. On the right, the horse is really a kind of an ornament, and it looks like he's bowing. He's bowing his head, and the king looks so debonair in his hunting outfit, and there's no sense of any kind of moodiness here at all. It's very, it's very different in that regard. And what I wanted to turn to now is the Paris Salon. I mean, we talked a little bit about the Royal Academy, and this is a painting of the Paris Salon. It's by someone named an artist named M. And it's a picture of the king Charles X distributing prizes after the Salon of 1824, so it's a painting from the following year. And Charles X was the king who was enthroned after the fall of Napoleon. So during the French Revolution, Charles X's predecessor, Louis XVI, was executed, and the monarchy, what was left of the monarchy really, went into exile. And after the defeat of Napoleon, they came back. We have what's called the Bourbon Restoration. And so that's what you have here. And you can see those paintings stacked up. It was held in the Louvre until I think it was 1855, and then the Salon just got too big, and so it had its own building, this Palace of Industry, where it was held later in the 19th century. But those paintings stacked up, some of them very, very large, and it really looks like a very official affair. I mean, after all, he's distributing prizes, distributing medals. And, the Salon had a jury. If you won a gold medal, then you didn't have to submit to the jury. I mean, generally that was generally the rule, I think, during the 19th century. But the Salon was also a form of popular entertainment. And you can get a sense of that in this painting by an artist named Billard called 4 O'Clock at the Salon, which was shown in the Salon of 1847. Also here in the Louvre, very crowded, not only with paintings, but also with people jostling each other. And it's interesting, and look at those guards dressed in red. They just look like they're yawning so hard that they're going to dislocate their jaws. And this man with the skull cap dressed in black is reading a newspaper. That's what Parisian newspapers looked like in the 19th century. They were these long things, usually just a few pages, but there were many of them, like many at the time. They would have lots and lots of newspapers. The Journal des Débats, there were just lots of these papers, the National, lots and lots of papers. And generally, each one of them had an art critic where they would have columns. Some of the critics very famous, people like Théophile Gautier, some of them not well known today except to experts. But this man perhaps is a critic as well, reading about what the other critics are saying. And one of the very first critics of art was Denis Diderot, who I'm showing you here in a portrait by Louis-Michel Van Loo from 1767. So Diderot is very much one of the intellectuals or philosophes of the Enlightenment. He was one of the editors of something called the Encyclopédie, the Encyclopedia, which, as it sounds, was an alphabetical, multi-volume publication that had articles on all kinds of things, everything from like farm machinery and technology to the education of children. And it really is very much in the spirit of the Enlightenment. And so is this portrait. I mean, it really looks like, going back to that self-portrait by Vigée-Lebrun or the portrait of Lavoisier and his wife by David. That sense of esprit, of some kind of inner life, wit, of vitality, intellect. And it's as if he's in a moment of inspiration as he writes. So Diderot would go to the Salon, and he was very, very opinionated. And he would write down and publish what he thought about the art. So what did he hate? This is the kind of thing he hated. I don't know whether this painting was actually in the Salon, but certainly there were others by François Boucher that were. This is called The Triumph of Venus, and it's really exemplifies what we call the Rococo. So the Rococo was art from, really starting in the early 18th century. It was especially strong in, say, the 1720s and 30s into the 40s. There are later examples, even, say, the 1760s. But it's an art that really has to do with eroticism and pleasure, delight. Very little happens in Rococo paintings. Like, there's almost no narrative. I mean, here Venus is triumphing. The fact that she's the love goddess really goes along very much with Rococo. And the colors tend to be things like pastels. That's when you mix a color with white. So you have rose, mint green, baby blue. That's the kind of colors that they liked. And all of these little putti, these little naked children, flying around with drapery. It's very light. It has a kind of lilting zigzaggy aspect to it. He really hated this, and he talked about associating Boucher with rosy dimpled behinds. He really disliked that. So what did he like? This is the kind of thing he liked. This is a painting by Jean-Baptiste Greuze called The Father's Curse, or The Ungrateful Son. It was in the Salon, 1777. And it's one of two paintings. This is sort of the part one. And there's a part two where the father is on his deathbed and the son is loaded down with guilt. And so what's going on here, it's a kind of a modern parallel to the story of the prodigal son. And what's going on here is that the son, who you can see with this look of horror, he's being cursed by his father because the son has gone off against the father's wishes and is enrolled in the military. And there is a kind of a sly recruiter over on the right there. And everything is up in turmoil, and the family is all gesticulating, making these theatrical expressions. That's the kind of thing that Diderot liked. He liked the fact that he saw this, as telling a story that's going to move you. And notice how the figures are arranged almost like on a stage. In fact, if you think back to the Death of Wolfe, and I talked about history paintings, this also is set up as if it's a history painting, even though it's just a scene from the life of ordinary people, anonymous ordinary people. So a scene from the lives of ordinary anonymous people is what we call a genre painting. And that was one of the types of paintings that was done at the time. In the Academy, in the Royal Academy, in France, they had a hierarchy called the hierarchy of genres. So history painting was at the top. That was considered the most prestigious. And then going down the ladder, you have things like portraiture, landscape. It's a little confusing because one of the genres is genre, which is these scenes from everyday life. There's a lot of examples of it. For example, 17th century Dutch painting is often, we have famous artists like Vermeer doing, genre paintings. But that was another type of painting. And then down at the very bottom, the last type of painting was still life, which they called nature morte, or dead nature. That was really the lowest of the low. Now, you could only do history painting if you had been accepted as a history painter. You had to sort of submit a diploma piece, a sort of a reception piece. And Greuze had flunked. He had been given this topic from ancient Roman history, Septimus Severus reproving his son, and it was considered not up to snuff. And so he had to be a genre painter, but he made his genre paintings be more like a history painting. Now, Diderot never got to see this painting. He died before it was shown. But I imagine that he probably would have been impressed by it. He had seen an earlier painting by Jacques-Louis David called Belisarius, and in an earlier Salon, and he had said, this young man has soul. So what we're dealing with here is a painting that just really represents a really radical separation from the Rococo. I mean, a complete rejection of it, an example of neoclassicism. And it's a painting which, for one thing, is roughly, these figures are roughly life size. It's really huge. So it's enormous, and it's enormously impressive. David went to Rome to paint it. He wanted to surround himself with antiquity, and it is a subject from early Roman history. It was also the subject of a play by the French classical dramatist Corneille. It was called Les Horaces, the Horatii. And he showed it in his studio in Rome. It was very well received. And then the next year, in 1785, in the Salon, where it really created something of a sensation. So what's going on here is that we have a scene from a wartime scene from early ancient Rome, where these three triplet brothers are swearing on their swords held up by their father. The father is Horatius, that they will fight to the death another set of triplets from a rival town. It's one of these sort of mythic things. What you have on the right are their sister Camilla. I think she's the one in the middle in a chair, who looks like she's mourning. So this is really telling the story in a very economical way, because what the brothers are going to do is go off and fight this other set of triplets called the Curati and defeat them and kill them. And their sister is actually going to go into deep mourning because one of the Curati, one of their enemies, is her fiancé. And in fact, one of these three brothers is married to the sister of their enemy as well. So there's this real conflict between patriotic duty and family ties. Now you can see on the left, there's this, the men are completely given up to the patriotic duty, and they have this angularity and hardness that goes along with their resolve. Whereas the women on the right look like they're sort of drooping, that they have this sort of, these rounded shapes that really suggest, a giving way to the family sentiment, and so this sort of division. And the story actually is pretty grim, because what happens is that after the defeat of the Curati, Camilla, as I said, she mourns for her dead fiancé, and one of her brothers actually kills her. And then the father defends his son who killed his daughter, which is really kind of creepy. And David was originally going to paint the father defending his son, and then decided instead on this extraordinary image of this oath-taking. The whole thing has a kind of a clarity of space and a hardness, the stone, the swords, the muscles, that really goes along with the resolve of these men. And, this whole idea of patriotic devotion was very much in the air around this time. So this is the years leading up to the French Revolution, which is going to start 5 years later in 1789. And David was going to completely throw himself into the French Revolution. He would become a radical. He voted for the death of the king. But none of that had happened yet. And in fact, this was a royal commission. I wanted to show you a drawing, a preparatory drawing for the painting, and it really exemplifies a kind of drawing that was taught in France in the late 18th and also throughout the 19th century as well. The origins are really Italian. It really relates to that Italian term disegno. It's this type of drawing that you could say was brought to France in the 16th century when King Francis I, François I, brought over these Italians, including Leonardo da Vinci, Primaticcio, and it's that central Italian tradition represented by people like Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, where you get these very incisive exterior contours, these lines defining the forms, and then this modeling, the chiaroscuro, that gives it a sculptural quality as well. And if you look at the calf of that figure in the front, the way it swells, an artist like David, who's really skilled at this, it's a little bit like, the fingers of a Yo-Yo Ma or a Lang Lang piano, playing the piano. Just the right amount of weight, makes all the difference in terms of giving you a sense of something turning in space. Now, as I said, the revolution hadn't happened yet at this point, but when it did, this idea of oath-taking really took on a whole new significance. And what I'm showing you here is a detailed drawing that David showed in the Salon of 1791, so this is after the revolution has begun, called the Tennis Court Oath. It was really intended for a gigantic painting, a study for a gigantic painting, which he never completed because events were happening so fast. There were people who quickly went out of favor, and other people who were eventually guillotined. And so this is something that he, from the revolution, this was a project that was never completed. So what's going on here? These are members of a self-proclaimed legislature, what was called the National Assembly, swearing that they will not disband until a constitution has been written and firmly established. Now, the event took place in 1790, but before that, in 1789, there had been there had been a really momentous event that really leads right into the French Revolution. As I mentioned, France was in very sorry economic shape. I had mentioned the wars. There also was a terrible tax system, which only taxed the most populous part of the country, which was what was called the Third Estate. So that included everyone from peasants to wealthy commoners. That was just about everyone. And the other two estates didn't pay any taxes. They were the aristocracy and the clergy. And what happened is that there was also a whole sort of, in addition to this economic crisis, there was a political crisis in that there were these bodies of jurists called Parlement. It sounds like parliament, but they actually were judicial instead of legislative. They were sort of like regional courts that carried out, you could say, the will of the king, because the king was really the center of justice, representative of justice. And the Parlement, especially the one in Paris, which was the most important, began to insist that they had the prerogative to make laws, not just to render justice. And so this really was a conflict. And also all of this comes together in May of 1789 when King Louis XVI decides to convoke what was called the Estates General. So that's the bringing together of representatives from these three estates, the aristocracy, the clergy, and then everybody else. And one of the problems that arose was that each one of these estates had a vote, and the other two, the aristocracy and the clergy, could always outvote the Third Estate. And so there was great resentment, and most of the Third Estate, together with some sympathetic members from the other two estates, formed this self-proclaimed legislature. And, the idea of having a constitution or a legislature, these really are Enlightenment ideas. They were very impressed by, say, the American Revolution, and I mentioned, figures like Benjamin Franklin and Washington being Enlightenment heroes. So in some ways, the Revolution is a kind of crescendo of the Enlightenment, and at the same time turns in a very dark direction. Towards something that really is like the first example of totalitarianism, during the Reign of Terror. So I also wanted to just compare this to an image that's very much from the world of divine right monarchy. It's Louis XIV, a painting by Hyacinthe Rigaud, which just shows this extraordinary pomp and arrogance, which is so different from what we have on the left. It's really, on the left, all of those men who are stretching their arms towards their president, who is a man named Bailly. He was a famous astronomer. I think he was the mayor of Paris as well. They are really representing a concept that you get in Rousseau's The Social Contract, which was very important during the French Revolution as a text, which is the idea of general will. It's not really the same as democratic rule. It's a more abstract idea. And there was a lot of enthusiasm and idealism associated with lawmaking at the time. So, for example, this is a medallion that was worn by members of the Legislative Assembly. That was the assembly that came into being after that Constitution was made. And you can see that they, surrounded by rays as if it's some kind of divine, sacred object. It looks like the tablets of Moses, and it's inscribed rights of man and Constitution. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was the sort of the preamble to the Constitution. So we have that idealism, but we also have violence at the same time. The destruction of the Bastille, this fortified prison, which, in July, July 14, 1789, really represents a very different side of the revolution, and it really has given France, its patriotic holiday, Bastille Day, which is like our July 4th. And there were other kinds of violence as well. This is a really macabre cartoon by the English caricaturist James Gilray called Un petit souper à la Parisienne, or a family of sans-culottes. It's misspelled, refreshing after the fatigues of the day. The sans-culottes, that was what the radicals would call themselves, not wearing aristocratic breeches. And it's really a kind of horrific rejoinder to what were called the September massacres, where revolutionaries went into the prisons and massacred inmates who they thought were anti-revolutionary. And while there had been all of that idealism about the Constitution soon sort of fell into disuse because of the radicalization of politics at the time. And what I'm showing you here was sort of a ceremonial copy of that original Constitution, the Constitution of 1791, which was officially vandalized in 1793. That's the year, 1793-94. That's the time of the Reign of Terror. And it was as if this object became a sort of an abomination and had to be destroyed. And of course, there's the guillotine, which is the symbol of the Reign of Terror. It was supposed to be an enlightened way to kill people. And, compared to the way they killed people in the Renaissance, it was relatively painless and efficient. But I showed you Lavoisier earlier. He was guillotined, even though he was part initially of the revolution. He was leading a commission to establish standard weights and measures. But he had been a wealthy financier working with taxation with the regime before the revolution, and people like that were really hated, and so he was executed. There was a radical named Jean-Paul Marat, who was a friend of David's, who was executed. So Marat was one of these members of what was called the Committee of Public Safety. They really were responsible for sending people to the guillotine. And he was murdered in the bath by a woman named Charlotte Corday, who really was aligned with his political opponents. David represented him there. So he's in the bath because he suffered from a skin disease. And so that's where he did a lot of his work. And you can see that this also is, again, one of these modern history paintings. There are all these details that are made to make it look authentic, the way that he is still holding the quill, still working for the people up to his last breath, the bloody knife on the ground, the note, the sort of decoy note that allowed Charlotte Corday to come in and kill him, and the way that this simple packing crate, as if he's leading this Spartan lifestyle. He's given up everything for the people. It's inscribed to Marat, David. David has signed it there. It really functions as a kind of a grave marker, a funerary marker. And it's really interesting that on the one hand, Catholicism was really being persecuted during the French Revolution, but that was really what they knew. In other words, it has the look of a dead Christ, and this void above him seems to be charged with a kind of spiritual presence. It's really interesting that even at this time of the revolution, you could have things that didn't have anything to do with politics. For example, this painting by David's student Anne-Louis Giraudet-Triesson of Endymion, this beautiful young man who the moon fell in love with him, and she put him in a spell and then would make love to him in the form of moonbeams as she went across the sky. I mean, seems to be light years away from what we were just looking at. And classical antiquity could also be associated with the irrational, like in a drawing like this one by Henry Fuseli, called The Artist Moved by the Grandeur of Ancient Ruins, where this figure is just overwhelmed by the size of these extraordinary fragments. If you've ever been to the Capitoline Museum in Rome, you've probably seen that big foot. And Fuseli, who was a Swiss artist, I mentioned he became part of the Royal Academy in England, was also a master of the horrific. And this is a famous painting. It's now in this one version is in Detroit, The Nightmare, which shows this swooning woman with a horrible incubus sitting on her chest. And it's all completely irrational and made to give you a sense of chills and thrills. And if we're talking about this as a kind of dark side, counter-Enlightenment image, it's really interesting to think about Goya, his full name, Francisco de Goya y Lucientis. We just call him Goya, here in this self-portrait from a series of etchings called Los Caprichos, where he has a kind of a guarded look. And on the one hand, he hung around with enlightened figures, people who were sympathetic to the Enlightenment in Spain, and yet at the same time, he really was so pessimistic that he really, it seems very far removed from the Enlightenment. For example, in this, which was supposed to be a tapestry for a cartoon, for a tapestry commissioned by the Royal Tapestry Works, that it was these women playing a game, bouncing this mannequin, but it really is kind of creepy, isn't it? And it really seems to suggest something very pessimistic about relations between the sexes, or this famous frontispiece from The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, where this artist it's as if he is sleeping, and when reason is sleeping, then you can have all of these horrors. It sounds like a Enlightenment message, but the whole thing is so dark and spooky. Here's a detail. Or when Goya attacks aristocratic snobbery, like this one as far back as his grandfather, where the donkey is showing that he comes from a long line of asses. And now, when Goya painted his friends, he could be very frank, and giving this, painting of this, his friend Don Andres de Peral, who was a gilder in the Spanish court. Goya himself actually, at the end of it was about 1799, became the first painter to the king. It really has a kind of extraordinary inner life and frankness. But when he brought that frankness to royal portraits, like this one of King Charles IV on horseback, it really disturbs our sense of royalty. In other words, the great Baroque tradition, which we saw David reviving, in that Napoleon at St. Bernard, here seems to be cracking in a way under the weight of clear observation. And I don't think he meant it as satirical at all, but somehow we feel like we're no longer in the age of the Baroque. That was the time when the age of the Baroque, when Diego Velázquez painted the Prince Balthasar Carlos on horseback. It looks like a big pony, actually, where he looks like he has a sense of command that early 19th century king does no longer has. So that brings us to a counter-Enlightenment figure, William Blake, who I'm showing you a portrait on the left, and then the frontispiece from one of his prophetic books called Europe, a Prophecy. And I chose that because he really thought of himself as being like a prophet, like a Hebrew prophet, receiving the breath of inspiration. He didn't believe that, and of course he was a great poet as well as a painter, as an artist, and a printmaker, and he would illustrate his own works, or he would illuminate, rather, his poetry, his writings. And I wanted to show you this drawing that he made on the left, this strange creature. It looks like something from his imagination completely, and he really believed that he was a seer, that he could see spirits. And the idea that this is the man who taught Blake painting, some kind of a spiritual, prophetic figure, really separates Blake so much from this man here, who was the first president of the Royal Academy, Sir Joshua Reynolds, who shows himself as, wearing the cap of Rembrandt, before a statue of Michelangelo. And Reynolds taught that you could become a great artist if you imitated good examples. And Blake really hated that. He owned a copy of Reynolds' discourses. Those were the speeches Reynolds gave when prizes were given out at the Royal Academy. And Blake wrote nasty things in the margins, like this man was born to depress art. And this is a work by Blake called Elohim Creating Adam, and clearly has a reference to the Michelangelo's creation of Adam from the Sistine Chapel, which he never went to Italy, but he would have known it through reproduction, say Prince. But it's so pessimistic. It looks like Adam here is very unwillingly being brought into being, unlike what we have on the right. And of course, what we have in the Blake is something that's really occurring in sacred space and in sacred time. And I just wanted to show you briefly two of his most famous publications, The Songs of Innocence, 1789. There was, that's the beginning of the Revolution. There was initially in England enthusiasm. And then The Songs of Experience, which are really much more dark, 1793, 94 was the French Revolution. And I just wanted to suggest that, here's one, a page from the Songs of Innocence on the left, The Divine Image, very upbeat. The Sick Rose on the right, a very downcast a bit of poetry, and how they, the illumination, the design really goes along with them. So in the one on the left, it's to mercy, pity, peace, and love all pray in their distress, and to these virtues of delight return their thankfulness. So it really has that sort of flame-like, buoyant aspect, whereas the Sick Rose, O rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. So I wanted to just turn to something very, very different from Blake, which is a world really of high society portraiture, like this painting on the right, which is known as Pinky. It was a very young girl. She was only 12, Sarah Moulton Barrett, shown in the Royal Academy in 1795. And unfortunately, she had actually died shortly before the exhibition. And what I'm comparing it with, and I really think of this work on the right as an early romantic portrait, I'm comparing it with an earlier work, just a decade earlier, by Thomas Gainsborough of the famous actor Sarah Siddons. The Sarah Siddons is all about gorgeous surface, that incredible striped dress, the fur muff, all of this gorgeous surface, whereas the one on the right has so much personality, and the way that her capriciousness, that inner life, seems to somehow be reflected in the sky behind her. And here's a kind of male equivalent on the left, which is in the LA County Museum. Arthur Atherley is an Etonian, referring to the great, the famous school Eton, this very upper crust young man with this dark, sort of moody landscape behind him. This idea of, an outdoor portrait is something that really is part of Lawrence's work. And he became Sir Thomas Lawrence and became eventually the president of the Royal Academy. But with portraits like this in mind, take a look at this. This is called Buff, a black poodle, by a British artist who tended to specialize in animals, James Ward, from 1812. And this comes from a wonderful book by my dissertation advisor, Bob Rosenblum, called The Dog and Art, where he really tells art through dogs because they really change with style. And here, Buff, who was a heroic dog, he had belonged to an officer, a lieutenant colonel, who had fought in what was called the Peninsular War. Those were the wars against Napoleon in Spain and Portugal, and apparently had acted very heroically. And he's shown here on a cliff. It's actually the cliffs of Dover, with the wind blowing in his ears. And this kind of heroic, you could say this is a romantic portrait as well, takes us back to Napoleon, which I started with, and I hope you'll join me next week where you'll hear more about him. Thanks. And if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to address them.
Ooh, if you wouldn't mind just waiting a second for the microphone, I will come bring it down to you.
Just wondering about the lips on the shark, the famous shark lips, which don't exist in nature. What possessed him?
That's really, I never thought of that. I mean, I'm not a shark expert, but that really is interesting. I mean, sort of like anthropomorphizing the shark, like make it more. It also, it has overtones of, with that shark coming for him, and he's in the nude, swimming in the nude. It has overtones of a last judgment, or some kind of, battle for a soul, with Satan and God, that sort of, or Christ, that sort of battle between good and evil that, takes this event and really takes it to a higher realm. But I'll have to take a look at those lips. So, sure.
So regarding Watson and the shark, when I trained here at the MFA to be a guide, we were told that Watson's pose was of the Apollo Belvedere.
Oh, he actually, he looks like the Borghese gladiator. That's another very famous statue. But the idea of taking, a famous ancient statue and using that as a model, that was something that was very much part of the, art of the time.
What was the role of art in America at this time? I tend to think of 18th century American art as pretty much straight up portraits.
Yeah.
And we didn't really, how much did we partake in this Enlightenment and Romanticism movement?
Yeah, I think that portraiture really was the big thing. In some ways it goes along with, it was very big in England too. Sir Joshua Reynolds, in his discourses talked about how, history painting is the highest calling, but he did portraits. And so he came up with something that we call like a history portrait, where there were portraits that had some kind of learned, references. Like, I think there's a copy of it here. There's one of Sarah Siddons, the actor Sarah Siddons as the tragic muse, the famous one. So in the colonies, I've always thought of that prevalence of portraiture as, in the United States, there's this sense of, well, if you're going to do something, make it worth something and make it worth some money. And somehow, doing a portrait of somebody seemed to have a, that sort of value. There's also that sort of love of tangible things, of actual things. But, you do get, certainly you do get romantic art eventually in the United States as well. Our tradition, I always thought of our romantic tradition as tending to be tied up with landscape, like the Hudson River School and, that sort of thing.
Thank you. I'm very curious about the portrait of Napoleon, the hyper-realistic, historically accurate one that you contrasted with the David that's on the screen. Where is that hanging, and how was that received by critics and or the public?
That's a really good question. I'm trying to remember where that, whether the Delaroche is in the Louvre. I can't remember.
Okay.
I'm not really sure. I've always wondered that myself.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure of that. Generally speaking, Delaroche had admirers. We're going to see him later on. He could paint things that were just incredibly realistic and specific. There's a wonderful portrait by him that I'll show you later that's actually in the 19th century gallery here of the Marquis de Pastoret. That is just, you can see every wrinkle. That is so really pretty incredible. It seems that by the, it's interesting because that one is 1848. During the 1840s, generally in France, there was a lot of passion for Napoleon. He was brought back and reburied. He had died on the island of St. Helena, and he was brought back to Paris in 1840 with great ceremony. And there were some really eccentric people who really compared him to Christ and thought that the Battle of Waterloo was like Golgotha, and and I'll show you later on. I think it's in my fourth lecture, a sculpture of Napoleon reawakening to immortality, which is from the 1840s. But the Delaroche that I showed is just completely different. It really seems to have to do with this taste for empirical fact, which is a problem for hero making. It's something that really, if you're really focused on all those, what seem to be facts, then it's hard to have that sort of heroic, grandeur.
Okay, I think we've got our questions in. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thank
We'll
you.
see you
Thank
all
you
here
for
next
coming.
week.